Stand at the base of the White Tower and look up. 15 feet of solid stone, 4.5 meters of Kentish ragstone and Cayenne limestone, bonded with lime mortar, rising 27 meters into the London sky. This is the thickness of a modern battleship's hull. This is the specification for a bunker, not a palace. The official story tells us this was built as a royal residence by William the Conqueror in 1078, a home for kings. Yet when you examine the arrow loops in the basement, something doesn't align. They're too narrow for effective archery. The angles are wrong for defensive fire. But they're perfectly positioned for ventilation, for airflow into a core that was never designed to breathe naturally. The White Tower is the centerpiece of the Tower of London, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by 3 million people annually. They come to see the crown jewels, to hear stories of Anne Boleyn's ghost, to photograph the yeoman warders in their Tudor costumes. What they don't see are the modern fiber optic cables running into medieval walls, the CCTV cameras mounted on Norman stonework, the sections of the basement marked "No Public Access," with no historical justification, the Ministry of Defence warning signs on doors that supposedly lead to storage rooms. This isn't a heritage site. This is an active facility, and the evidence is hiding in plain sight. Let's start with the mathematics. The official timeline states the White Tower was completed in 20 years, from 1078 to 1098. This was supposedly achieved under the direction of Gundulf of Rochester, a Benedictine monk elevated to bishop and credited with military engineering expertise that appears nowhere in his prior biography. The structure he allegedly designed contains approximately 56,000 tons of stone. Let me repeat that figure. 56,000 tons. 11,000 tons of that total is Caen stone, imported from Normandy across the English Channel. In the 11th century, maritime transport relied on wooden cargo vessels called cogs or nars. A typical merchant ship of this era could carry 15 to 20 tons of cargo. Stone blocks require careful ballasting to prevent capsizing. Let's be generous and assume 20 tons per voyage. 11,000 divided by 20 equals 550 voyages. But weather limits safe channel crossings to late spring through early autumn. Perhaps 5 months of reliable shipping per year. A round trip, loading at Caen, sailing to London, unloading at a primitive Thames wharf, returning, would take 7 to 10 days minimum, wind dependent. If William the Conqueror commissioned a fleet of 5 dedicated stone ships, an extraordinary expense diverting resources from military transport, they could complete perhaps 20 voyages per season, 100 loads per year. At that rate, delivering the Caen stone alone requires 5.5 years of perfect execution. 0 storms, 0 shipwrecks, 0 delays. And this calculation excludes the 45,000 tons of Kentish ragstone that had to be quarried at Maidstone, barged down the Medway, and hauled up the Thames against the tide. The coordination of over 3,000 barge loads and 500 shiploads into a construction site with no modern wharfage creates a logistical bottleneck that defies the 20-year completion timeline. The river traffic alone would have paralysed the commercial life of the Pool of London. Now consider the labour. Data from the Guédelon Castle project in France, where modern masons are building a 13th century castle using period tools, provides a forensic baseline. A skilled mason can dress approximately 1 ashlar block per day. The thousands of tons of facing stone represent tens of thousands of individual man-days of cutting. And lime mortar cannot be laid in freezing conditions. It fails to cure and cracks. This restricts construction to 6 to 8 months per year. Let's calculate this precisely. An average ashlar block for architectural facing measures roughly 0.1 cubic meters. That's a block weighing approximately 220 kilograms. If 11,000 tons of Caen stone were cut into blocks of this size, we're looking at 50,000 individual blocks. 50,000 blocks at 1 block per mason per day equals 50,000 man-days of cutting alone. That's before transportation, before lifting, before setting, before pointing the mortar joints. If you employed 100 master masons, an enormous workforce for 11th century England, working 6 months per year due to weather, that's 180 working days per season. 100 masons producing 180 blocks per season equals 18,000 blocks per year. To produce 50,000 blocks requires nearly 3 years of continuous cutting. And we haven't even discussed the labour required for the quarrying, the transportation, or the actual construction. To complete the White Tower in 20 years, maintaining pace with the logistical supply would require hundreds of masons working in perfect synchronization every season for 2 decades. There is no census data, no supply records, no documentary evidence of a workforce of this scale being mobilized in 11th century London. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, makes no mention of such an operation. For context, the entire population of London at that time was perhaps 15,000 people. Where did the workforce come from? Where did they live? What did they eat? The silence in the historical record is deafening. Hold this information in your memory. 56,000 tons, 20 years. Impossible maritime logistics. Impossible workforce requirements. In a moment, we'll return to these numbers, and you'll understand why the structure you're looking at is older than the Normans claim. But first, let me introduce you to John Taylor. In 1843, the Duke of Wellington ordered the moat of the Tower of London drained. The official reason was hygiene. The water had become, in the language of the time, obnoxious with smell. Taylor was a young surveyor assigned to the drainage project. When the water level dropped, he documented what he found in the silt. The official reports describe putrid animal and excrementitious matter, but Taylor's personal notes, later classified under the Defence of the Realm Act, tell a different story. The sludge wasn't organic waste. It contained heavy metal compounds, nitrate residues, the chemical signature of industrial runoff. Taylor noted that certain sections of the foundation, exposed for the first time in centuries, showed tunnels at water level that didn't appear on any medieval map. Openings that led beneath the curtain walls, sealed behind later brickwork. He requested permission to survey these passages. Permission was denied. Taylor was quietly transferred to another project. His final reports on the moat were sealed. They remain sealed today. A logical question arises here. Why drain a moat for hygiene when a simple dredging operation would clear the smell and silt? Why permanently convert it to a dry ditch unless you needed access to the foundation levels without water ingress? And what was in those tunnels that warranted classifying a surveyor's notes for over a century? The drainage operation coincides with something else: the systematic demolition of the tower's industrial past. For 500 years, the Tower of London wasn't a museum. It was a working complex. The Royal Mint operated here, striking coins and processing precious metals. The Ordnance Office tested weapons and manufactured munitions. The Record Office stored state documents. By the 1840s, the tower was a smoke-filled industrial zone: furnaces, forges, chemical works. Then, between 1845 and 1855, Anthony Salvin and John Taylor, yes, the same Taylor, oversaw a radical transformation they called restoration. Salvin demolished the Great Hall, the ordnance warehouses, and the administrative buildings of the Mint. He removed the post-medieval structures that showed the tower's industrial function. What replaced them? The casemates. These are the neat, uniform buildings along the outer ward that now house the yeoman warders. The name casemate is revealing. In military architecture, a casemate is a fortified gun emplacement, a hardened chamber built into defensive walls. While the facades of Salvin's casemates look domestic, the rear of these structures is buried under thousands of tons of earth and rampart stone. They are blast-proof bunkers disguised as housing. Why build bomb-resistant accommodation for tour guides? At this point, you might think this is standard Victorian restoration. Medieval castles across Britain underwent similar work in the 19th century. And that's a logical thought. But let's look at what else Salvin did. He demolished the record office, buildings, and relocated the archives. The detailed construction plans for the 17th and 18th centuries, the era of maximum industrial activity, are missing. Fires destroyed some records. Others were misfiled. What remains is a 250-year gap in the subsurface blueprints. We have medieval surveys from 1597. We have Victorian surveys from 1850 onwards. But the centuries when the tower's tunnels would have been expanded and upgraded, blank. The archives didn't just burn. They were edited. And the edits started exactly where the tunnels began. Modern ground-penetrating radar reveals linear voids radiating from the White Tower toward the outer bastions. These aren't sewers. They're reinforced, air-filled galleries. In the noisy electromagnetic environment of London, clear void signatures indicate structured chambers, likely concrete or ashlar-lined tunnels. Unlike random rubble, which scatters radar signals, these anomalies show geometric regularity. They run from the White Tower's basement toward Leger's Mount, the northwest bastion, toward the sites where Salvin built his casemates, toward the areas now marked no public access. Leger's Mount itself presents another anomaly. Excavations in the 20th century recovered crucibles from a 16th century metallurgical furnace buried in the bastion's foundations. These weren't coin-making crucibles. They were high-temperature vessels for processing unusual alloy types. The official mint was located in a separate building. Why was there a secret furnace in a defensive bastion, capable of reaching temperatures that would challenge even modern industrial equipment? What were they smelting that required isolation from the main facility? The crucibles were catalogued, photographed, and then quietly stored away. No public exhibition, no detailed analysis published. Just another anomaly filed under historical curiosity. In 1869, the Tower subway was constructed. Officially, it's a failed pedestrian tunnel beneath the Thames, converted to a utility conduit. But examine the engineering specifications. The tunnel uses cast iron segments, massively over-engineered for a simple footpath. In 1940, a German bomb exploded on the riverbed directly above the tunnel. The blast compressed the structure but failed to breach it. This is the durability profile of a military-grade installation. In 1897, the London Hydraulic Power Company acquired the Tower subway. The LHPC operated a high-pressure water mains network, £700 per square inch, that powered theatre stages, industrial lifts, and heavy machinery across London. This wasn't a decorative system. 700 psi is enough pressure to shear through steel cable. The hydraulic network could lift entire stage sets, operate industrial presses, and power machinery that would otherwise require steam engines. The hydraulic mains were routed through the Tower subway, terminating at the Tower of London. Why? Route industrial power to a heritage site. The Tower had its own water engine at Traitor's Gate for centuries. It didn't need external power for heating or domestic lighting, but it would need external power for something that demanded massive torque and continuous operation. Server arrays, ventilation systems for deep-level spaces, heavy-duty air handling units, the kind of machinery that runs 24 hours a day, drawing power from an independent grid that can't be monitored by civilian utilities. The kind of machinery that hums. This detail seems trivial. It isn't. The Tower subway is still active. Officially, it carries water mains and telecommunications cables. In forensic terms, this confirms the Tower is a node in the telecommunications backbone of London, physically wired into the city's infrastructure via a hardened, bomb-proof artery that bypasses the civilian grid entirely. Let me take you underground in another sense. The area immediately surrounding the Tower is riddled with abandoned transport infrastructure. Tower of London Station, closed in 1884. Mark Lane Station, closed in 1967. When underground stations close, they leave substantial voids, platforms, tunnels, access shafts. In secure facility engineering, adjacent abandoned tunnels are liabilities unless they're requisitioned. You don't leave empty spaces next to sensitive installations. You either fill them or you control them. The proximity of these voids to the Ministry of Defence's deep-level Pindar bunker system and the Whitehall tunnels cannot be ignored. The tower, as a royal fortress, would logically be a node in the government's subterranean continuity of government network. The ghost stations provide the perfect interface between public transport and the secure state tunnel system. They're hidden in plain sight beneath Tower Hill. Now let's talk about what people feel when they visit. The Tower of London is famous for its hauntings, cold spots in the White Tower, a persistent hum reported by visitors to the Salt Tower, sudden nausea and unease in the basement levels. Ghost tour guides attribute this to supernatural presences. But let's approach this as environmental data. In thermodynamics, stone has high thermal mass. It retains heat. A localized temperature drop of 10 degrees Celsius in a solid masonry structure is anomalous. It suggests the presence of active cooling. High-performance computing infrastructure requires climate control. Server farms generate enormous heat. A modern data center produces approximately 10,000 watts of heat per server rack. If you're running computational equipment in a medieval basement, you need industrial-grade air conditioning. That means venting cooled air through concealed ducts. The cold spots aren't supernatural. They're HVAC exhaust behind stone facings. The hum is equally explainable. Large-scale ventilation fans for underground facilities produce infrasound, low-frequency vibrations between 10 and 50 Hz. This frequency penetrates solid stone and soil. It's below the threshold of conscious hearing, but the human body perceives it physiologically. At 18.9 Hz, infrasound triggers the fear frequency, a resonance that causes unease, nausea, and the sensation of being watched. The haunted feeling in the tower may be a direct reaction to unshielded industrial machinery operating beneath the tourist routes. Then there are the electromagnetic field spikes. Paranormal investigators consistently record readings of 50 to 100 milligauss in areas like the Salt Tower. To put this in context, a 1,000-year-old stone building with no active wiring in the walls should have a flat EMF profile, 0 to 2 milligauss. Modern domestic wiring produces 2 to 5 milligauss. Sudden jumps to 100 milligauss indicate the presence of high-voltage cables or transformers. If these spikes occur near specific walls or floors, they trace the path of concealed conduits. The hauntings map remarkably well to the likely routing of power cables from the tower subway intake toward the White Tower's central core. In a moment, we'll return to this fact, and everything will change. I know what you're thinking right now. Old buildings have drafts. Modern buildings nearby generate electromagnetic interference. London is full of underground machinery. Surely this is coincidence, and that's a reasonable skepticism. But consider the pattern. The cold spots appear in areas with no windows, no external airflow, and no modern climate control visible to the public. The EMF spikes cluster around sections marked no entry or private. The infrasound reports correlate with sections of the basement directly above the linear voids detected by ground-penetrating radar. Each piece of evidence is ambiguous alone. Together, they form a signature. The signature of an active facility concealed within a historic one. Let's examine the structure itself. The White Tower uses Kentish ragstone for its core, bonded with red tile courses, Lydian brick. This isn't merely decorative. The alternating layers of stone and tile create what modern engineers call a composite material. The tiles, being fired clay, have different electrical properties than limestone. The result is a structure that naturally dampens external electromagnetic fields. The tower is, inadvertently or by design, a Faraday cage. In the 21st century, this makes it an ideal location for high-security telecommunications and server arrays. Signals don't leak out. Scanning doesn't penetrate in. Now consider the layout. The basement of the White Tower is divided by a massive crosswall running the full height of the building. This wall doesn't support residential floors. It partitions the interior into isolated sections. In castle design, this is unusual. In bunker design, this is standard. Compartmentalization. If one section is compromised, the others remain secure. The arrow loops we discussed at the beginning. Too narrow for archery, but perfectly sized for ventilation. For drawing air through the core without exposing large openings to the exterior. The Chapel of St. John, located on the second floor of the White Tower, presents its own geometric puzzle. The chapel is built in the Romanesque style with a vaulted ceiling supported by massive columns. But examine the stonework closely. The precision of the apsidal aisle vaults implies knowledge of stereotomy, advanced stone-cutting geometry, that was supposedly lost in Europe during the Dark Ages. The tooling marks on the columns show a progression from crude axework to refined chisel finishing, suggesting the masons were learning as they worked. Learning what? How to match the precision of stones that were already there. The thickness of the walls, 15 feet at the base, exceeds any defensive requirement of the 11th century. Medieval siege engines couldn't breach 5 feet of solid stone. 15 feet is protection against something far more powerful. Modern artillery, aerial bombardment, or radiation shielding. Does this sound impossible? Let's check the historical record. During the Second World War, the Tower of London served as a military garrison and a site for holding high-value prisoners. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, was briefly held here. The tower was bombed during the Blitz, but certain sections sustained no visible damage despite direct hits nearby. The North Bastion, constructed by Salvin in the 1850s, absorbed blast force that leveled buildings across the river. This isn't luck, this is engineering. The tower is the 0 point for the Ordnance Survey, the national mapping agency of Great Britain. All geodetic measurements for the United Kingdom originate from a benchmark at the tower. This mirrors the strategy used for the Kremlin in Moscow or the Vatican in Rome. Ancient, high-mass structures repurposed as secure command and control nodes. Their physical mass provides better protection against modern electronic warfare than any concrete bunker. They're harder to destroy, and their heritage status makes them impossible to demolish without international outcry. They're the perfect camouflage. Remember that number from the beginning: 56,000 tons, 20 years, impossible logistics, impossible workforce. Here's the payoff. The structure exists. The mathematics say it shouldn't, which means either the mathematics are wrong or the structure is older than claimed. If the White Tower incorporates pre-existing Roman fortifications, the Arx Palatina, a citadel of Roman Londinium, then the Normans didn't build it, they refurbished it. They armoured an existing core, one that already had foundations deep enough and walls thick enough to support the weight. One that already had subterranean chambers connected to the city's lost infrastructure. The Romans had concrete. They had hydraulic engineering. They had surveying tools and construction methods that wouldn't be matched in Europe for 1,000 years. If the tower sits atop a Roman military installation, then the medieval structure is a shell, a renovation. And what lies beneath? Those linear voids, those concealed tunnels, those foundations 15 feet thick, is something far older and far more substantial. Gundulf of Rochester, the alleged architect, travelled to Jerusalem before 1059. He would have seen the fortifications of Constantinople, the Crusader castles of the Levant, the Cyclopean masonry of the Eastern Mediterranean. When he returned to England and was tasked with designing the White Tower, he didn't invent a new fortress. He applied Eastern engineering techniques to rehabilitate an existing one. His role wasn't creation, it was asset management. A skeptic at this moment would say, "You're speculating. Where's the proof the Romans built a fortress here?" And that's a fair challenge. But consider what we know. Roman Londinium had walls. Sections of those walls are incorporated into the tower's outer defences. The Kentish ragstone in the White Tower's base is identical to the stone used in Roman London. The tower sits at the strategic high ground of the city, the exact location where a military command post should be. And Gundulf's miraculous construction speed makes sense if he was refitting a standing structure rather than building from nothing. The proof isn't in what's visible, it's in what's missing. Where are the construction records? Where are the payment ledgers for 56,000 tons of stone? Where are the accounts of the workforce? The Norman chroniclers documented everything: battles, taxes, land grants. Yet the construction of their most important fortress in England is described in a few vague sentences. Either the records were lost, or they were never made. And records aren't made when you're disguising a rehabilitation as a construction project. Now, let's discuss what's happening at the tower today. Not in 1078, not in 1843, today. The Tower of London is managed by Historic Royal Palaces, a registered charity, but it remains a royal fortress under the ultimate authority of the Crown. Certain sections are leased to the Ministry of Defence. The precise boundaries of these sections are not published. The yeoman warders, those colourful tour guides, are retired military personnel. They live on site in the casemates. They maintain security protocols that exceed the requirements of a museum. Armed police are stationed at the perimeter. CCTV coverage is comprehensive. Access to the basements is strictly controlled. This isn't archaeology. This is asset protection. When you visit the tower, you follow a predetermined route. You see the crown jewels, the White Tower's chapel, the displays of armour. You don't see the basement levels of the Wakefield Tower. You don't enter the substructure of the Martin Tower. You don't access the foundations of the curtain walls. These areas are closed for conservation or safety. No explanation is provided. No timeline is given for when they might reopen. They're simply off-limits. If the tower were merely a museum, there would be no reason to restrict access to empty cellars. But if those cellars house active infrastructure, server rooms, communications equipment, secure storage, then the restrictions make perfect sense. The heritage site is a cover. The medieval castle is camouflage for a modern facility. The security presence is worth examining in detail. The tower is patrolled by armed officers from the Metropolitan Police's Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Unit. These aren't museum guards. They're counter-terrorism specialists carrying semi-automatic weapons. Their presence is explained as protection for the crown jewels, valued at billions of pounds. But the jewels are kept in a modern vault with security systems that would rival any bank. The armed presence is comprehensive, extending to areas of the tower where tourists never go. Why post armed guards at the entrance to empty crypts? The CCTV network deserves special attention. Modern heritage sites typically install visible cameras as deterrents against theft and vandalism. The tower's camera system is different. The density of coverage exceeds what's needed for crowd management. Cameras monitor corners where tourists don't go. They watch doorways marked staff only and private. They track movement patterns through areas that are supposedly unimportant storage spaces. This is the surveillance profile of a secure facility, not a museum. Someone is watching those feeds in real time. Someone is recording every movement through every corridor. Traitor's Gate, the water entrance from the Thames, presents another operational puzzle. The gate was historically used to bring prisoners into the tower by boat, avoiding hostile crowds on the streets. Today, it's presented as a historical curiosity, closed to river traffic. But the gate's mechanism is maintained. The portcullis can still be raised. The water channel beneath it connects to a system of culverts and drains that run beneath the entire fortress complex. In the 19th century, the tower had a water engine at this location, a pump system for managing water levels and providing hydraulic pressure. That engine was supposedly decommissioned, yet the infrastructure remains intact. Why maintain a functional water gate in an age of road transport? Because water provides something roads don't: invisible access. A small boat entering Traitor's Gate at night, when the tower is closed to visitors, leaves no street-level record. No CCTV footage from civilian cameras, no witnesses. Water access allows personnel and equipment to enter and exit the facility without public observation. The Thames is monitored by Port of London Authority and police patrol boats. both of which would recognize authorized Ministry of Defense movements as routine rather than suspicious. The telecommunications cables in the tower subway terminate somewhere. The high-pressure hydraulic lines installed in 1897 fed machinery somewhere. The linear voids detected by ground-penetrating radar lead somewhere. That somewhere is beneath your feet when you stand in the White Tower. The question isn't, what happened here 900 years ago? The question is, what's happening here now? Governments don't guard piles of stones. They guard assets. They don't route military-grade telecommunications through tourist attractions. They don't maintain classified sections in museums. They don't seal surveyors' reports for a century because of embarrassing smells. Let's close the circle on John Taylor. After his transfer from the Tower Drainage Project, he worked on routine civil engineering until his retirement. He never spoke publicly about what he found beneath the moat, but his personal papers, released under the 50-year rule in the 1990s, contain a single cryptic note dated 1844. The foundation is not the foundation. The cellar is not the cellar. The fortress never stopped being a fortress. Taylor understood. He saw beneath the official story. He recognized that the drainage operation wasn't about hygiene. It was about access. Access to install the infrastructure that would allow the tower to function as a secure node in the industrial age, and later, the digital age. The 19th century restoration wasn't preservation. It was an upgrade. Salvin didn't restore the medieval tower. He sanitized it. He removed the overt industrial buildings that made the site's true function obvious. He created a picturesque historical attraction that could generate revenue and control public perception. And beneath that attraction, he installed the infrastructure for a hardened facility that could operate for centuries. This is the British method. We don't build new bunkers in obvious locations. We repurpose existing fortifications. We hide modern installations inside historical shells. We classify the details under heritage protection laws, defense regulations, and institutional secrecy. The Tower of London is the crown jewel of this strategy, a fortress that never stopped being a fortress, protected by 56,000 tons of Norman camouflage and 900 years of carefully curated history. A facility where the past is the perfect cover for the present, where every tour group funds the operation they cannot see. Next time you visit, ignore the yeoman warder's jokes about the ravens. Walk to the base of the White Tower. Stand in the basement if they allow it. Put your hand against the stone. Feel the vibration. It's subtle. A low hum, barely perceptible. It isn't the tread of long-dead kings. It isn't the rattle of ghostly chains. It's the hum of machinery. 60 hertz. The frequency of the British electrical grid. The ghosts don't haunt the tower. The tower hums.